Welcome to Talking Absolute Worship. We're in week 2 of Lent, and my Lent discipline is going well. I have given up answering the phone for Lent, and it's been a marvellously quiet week. I'd recommend it to anyone. So, maybe everyone else in the congregation has forgotten about. Oh, Henriette's gone. Maybe everyone else has forgotten about Lent in your congregation, but you're here to remind them that it is still Lent. And we're going to start with Tim while Henriette recovers. Tim, where are you going with these readings this week?
Yeah, thank you. I love the idea of giving up answering the phone for Lent, and a whole train of things I could give up, which would make my life immeasurably better along those lines. Right, okay, so actually unusually this time for me, I'm going to focus mainly on the Psalm, which leaves plenty of scope, of course, for our other esteemed contributors. But just a brief look at Genesis, and then I'm going to dive into the Psalm, really. And Genesis is, of course, it's just one of the accounts, of which there are several, of God's covenant with Abraham. And at the heart of this covenant is God's promise that all will come well for Abraham. He will eventually, be the patriarch, and he will have a son, and through this son, his descendants will be as numerous as the stars of the sky, and all of that stuff. And also that there'll be inheritors of the land, which is kind of really important because Abraham himself is at this point only a sort of resident alien. So he's gonna kind of found this dynasty. But what comes across is that despite God's reassurances here, Abraham is maybe not doubting, but he's certainly there's an uncertainty about it. He's really not sure how this is all going to come to pass. He's not convinced that God's promises will hold, and his words rather reminded me of, I don't know if you ever read yourself or to your kids, the Winnie the Pooh stories. It rather reminded me, Abraham, of Eeyore in this particular sort of instance, with his opening sort of comments. He says, oh Lord God, what will you give me, for I continue childless? You've given me no offspring, and so a slave born in my house is to be my heir. So he's kind of really a bit down in the dumps about all of that.
It's like we were there in Winnie the Pooh land.
We're in that boggy place.
Then the link. See, I've driven Henriette away again. The link then for me into Psalm 27 comes in verse 6, where it says, he believed the Lord and it was reckoned to him as righteousness. And it's not the sort of belief that it's not kind of I believe in a kind of sudden response to a one-off event or a particular act or experience. I think it's more than that. It's kind of it's belief as continuous response, belief as trust and commitment to the God of the covenant, an acceptance finally of that promise. And that led me to Psalm 27, which is, again, it felt kind of really personal, not just to me, but I mean as a thing to use as an individual, less so as something that would sort of to a large group. I'm not sure you could sell this collectively, as it were. It's not going to be one of those stirring speeches that a commander gives before an army marches into battle. It's not of that kind of order. It's not addressed to a group or a nation asking them to put up with evildoers. How would this sound to those with the line, enemies all around me? And I was thinking, how would that play out in the fall of Afghanistan, or to those besieged in Aleppo, or something like that? So it's kind of much more individual. And the image that kind of came into my mind was like a lightning rod, really, a sort of conductor to strengthen individual faith, the sort that Abraham came to understand, a deepening resolve of the presence of eternal God. And so I started to look at the verses with that in mind, really. And verse 3, you've got, yet I will be confident. And so I started to look at individual choices of words, and confident, not heroic, but confident. And confidence is not always an easy thing to maintain. And that's certainly been true the last couple of years for so many people of all ages. We've certainly seen it in our youngest daughter, whose confidence throughout lockdown has been shaken. Her confidence to engage with other people has been really shaken. Confidence can really be shaken if it's not stirred. You see what I did there? But in verse 4, it says, one thing I asked of the Lord.
I feel like you really need to stop doing this. I'm really cracking up.
So what's the one thing he asked of the Lord? And again, it's not fame, it's not fortune, it's not even deliverance, really. It's to live in the house of the Lord my whole day, all the days of my life. And it's a kind of call to stoicism. Not in that kind of way we come to understand it these days of just having to put up with, I can't do anything about it, so I've got to put up with it. But in the knowledge that God is my light and my salvation. And with that knowledge, things become not simply bearable, but possible. Things a bit what you were saying in a previous one, Henriette, really about if you have that understanding of God, then other things become you can live through them, you can live with them. And I think, if you do know that, then a person can dwell in the house of the Lord, whether that house is a palace or a prison. If you know you live in the house of the Lord, and that's kind of an internal thing. And I found that this whole psalm spoke to me of that kind of covenantal relationship. And it understands what the situation is. It's not trying to gloss over it. It's not trying to make light of it. It understands the situation, but knowing that throughout all of that, as he says, my head is lifted up above my enemies. And to make a point about, covenant's not just some sweet twee thing. It's a really kind of serious undertaking. In one of the commentaries, this word about covenant was, covenants are like oaths, and that they are conditional self-curses. And I thought, wow, to think of a covenant as a conditional self-curse is really quite amazing. Quite, got to take this stuff seriously. And later in that same verse, he talks about verse 6, he says, I will sing and make melody to the Lord. And there were kind of echoes there of, Paul and Silas singing while in prison. Despite the situation, they could still sing to God. And then I was struck by, in verse 10, if my mother and father forsake me, the Lord will take me up. There's a person that I involved in a pastoral situation with, who's not one of our church members, but is involved through one of the outreach programs that we do. He's in his mid-50s and was rejected by his mother and father as a young man, and he's carried that with him all his life. He's very kind of turned inward, and he talks about having no self-worth at all. And it's really difficult because there's something lovely about him when you talk to him, but he has this incredibly negative image. And this is getting off piste a little bit, but it's so hard to know how to help him. It's so hard to find the right approach. That's another story for another time, perhaps. But I was thinking then about, if my mother and father forsake me, the Lord will take me up. And I kind of don't want to be trite. I don't want to be trite and say that's simply the answer to him, because that's not a place he's in, really, not with this particular person. But for us, as preachers, we are generally addressing people who do have faith. Most of the time, people in our congregation are there, and they're people who live with faith. And I think that main point then still stands, that with the sense of the presence of God, life can be understood and viewed very differently. God as kind of CBT, if you will. And shot through all of this psalm is hope. I believe I shall see the goodness of the Lord in the land of the living. and it goes on, wait for the Lord. And again, you see, a bit like earlier, I was thinking about the particular choice of words, wait for the Lord. And it's not, I don't think it's a passive wait. It's not, oh, well, again, can't do anything about it, I'll just wait. There's something that seems to be really positive in that sense of waiting, which kind of applies itself to Lent. It's a faith which is grounded in reality. You know, it's not jam tomorrow, but an existential grasp of what actually is, which then becomes transcended with faith, by faith, in faith, all of that stuff. So that's kind of all I ended up focusing on, really. But I ended up being taken up by that psalm, and I think that's where I would go, you know, for I very often, when I'm starting sort of sermon prep, just read all the readings and just make instant notes, you know, what first thoughts I call it, just whatever comes to mind, just whatever. And this one stuck with me. And I think sometimes when it sticks with you, you know, sometimes that's where you need to be. So kind of that's where I am for this second week of Lent.
Yeah, no, thank you. I'm glad to hear that, and I think it's always helpful for preachers to hear something about how other preachers form their ideas. I think I had a stretch preaching years ago where I think I probably got it into my head that I'd preached all of the readings before, and so I'd come to time for preparation and I'd say, yeah, I know about that. So I wouldn't actually read the readings. I'd just go straight to the commentary.
Yeah.
And I found that to be a kind of slightly barren time. I've gone back to doing just as you say. I usually print out all the 4 readings on a piece of paper, and then just read them on scribble notes. And that's usually where a dominant theme will come from. Instant connection, and it'll be different at different times I read it.
Absolutely, yeah.
That psalm is those words. I was thinking, why are those words familiar? And I thought, yeah, those words are so familiar because those of us who use the Northumbrian. No, that's not going to show because of this green screen thing. That's weird. Ooh, an invisible book. The Northumbrian Community Morning Prayer every day has a section of that psalm right at the beginning of morning prayer. One thing I have asked of the Lord, this is what I seek, that I may dwell in the house of the Lord all the days of my life, to behold the beauty of the Lord and to seek him in his temple. I think my doorbell's about to go, so if you can all fill in for a moment, then he's not going to ring it. That's cool. Carry on. So that happens every morning. That happens every morning. It goes on to say, who is it that you seek? We seek the Lord our God. Do you seek him with all your heart? Yes, Lord, have mercy. Do you seek him with all your soul? Obviously from Deuteronomy. But yeah, I think those immensely precious words. And I think preaching from the Psalms is often neglected. I think in our rush
I don't do it often, I must say.
In our rush to the gospel, I tend to rush to the gospel or the Old Testament because I love the Old Testament. Occasionally, I'll give Paul a look, but Psalms isn't usually the first place I go to, and I think it's quite refreshing for congregations to hear that and to be immersed in that world, because it kind of, as you were speaking, it was already sparking questions in my head about we don't know the circumstances of the situation in which this psalm was written, but it's clearly one of distress of some sort, or someone else's distress. It's written to address some situation of distress, and it kind of makes me think: what difference does faith make to situations of distress? And there's kind of one chain of thought, I think, as we touched on last week, that kind of said Christians shouldn't be experiencing the distress because all they need to do is pray and have faith, and then they don't hit their foot against a stone, which is one answer, which doesn't really get borne out in real life human experience. Or there's a more nuanced and subtle way of trying to approach this, to say, well, so what difference does faith make to somebody? So here's a guy who's going through distress, like anyone who could go through distress. his faith doesn't seem to diminish the distress, but his faith gives him something to hold onto through that distress, something very real and very tangible in his life that actually makes a difference to his mental health and his spiritual health and the way that he deals with it. And that might sound woolly and mealy-mouthed, but actually I think trying to find words to say that can be a really powerful thing. Yeah, Neil.
Yeah, I mean, as you were talking, one of the things that it made me think of is dear old, we've mentioned him a few times, but dear old blessed Walter Brueggemann.
Peace be upon his name.
Peace be upon his name. And his thing that I think many of us have found helpful as he explores the Psalms, the whole sense of orientation, and then that leads into disorientation, and then you get to a new orientation. And I think you see that playing out rather beautifully in this psalm, that, you know, here's someone who can who's traversing that kind of life is settled, I can sing my songs, I can praise God. Oh no, life is now flipped and everything has fallen apart, and where is God in that? And then ultimately getting to a different sort of place. It's that actually, I think that the powerful thing that both of you are picking up is it's things can fall apart. Faith can become much, much harder. I always remember C.S. Lewis saying, you know, when life is hard, don't talk to me about the consolation of religion. There is nothing consoling about religion when things are going wrong. It's quite the opposite. You know, it would be much easier not to believe. And here's in this psalm someone who comes through to a place where they can kind of say, actually, even given what's happened, I will still say there is a God. And that is an incredibly powerful journey that I suspect resonates for an awful lot of people. It's not, and the other thing that I'm struck by as you were talking is that it's not guaranteed that this is what happens. Because I can also think pastorally of occasions sitting down, and as I suspect all of us can, sitting down with the person who can actually say to you, you know, I could take you to a date when I lost my faith, and I can tell you what was going on and why. And as you explore it, it's often something, you know, a tragedy that has befallen them or someone they love or whatever. So there's nothing automatic about, you know, you go into suffering and you come out with faith that is reoriented. And I guess that's part of the dilemma of it.
Yeah. And I also think it's important to ask the question whether what's being said here is to be treated as live or psalmist reflecting on the experience afterwards. And I think the latter. This isn't a live running commentary of how he's feeling now. This is a reflection on how he's feeling at some point after these events have happened, I imagine, which is a very different kind of a time, isn't it? With the space of reflection. So yeah, it's not a blog or a vlog where he's dictating, this is what I'm feeling at this second. Yeah. Henriette.
Yeah, I just to come back on what you were saying, Neil, about Walter Brueggemann and how he does that. Sorry, I completely lost the words now, but orientation, disorientation, and a new orientation. And I find it really interesting that we don't preach so often from the Psalms, because they are life stories. And I agree with what you're saying, Phil, that it is probably an in hindsight story, but it sometimes does remind me of, I do journal a lot. And sometimes when you then look back over your journals over the years, there is that similar cadence almost, like, oh, this is what life is, oh, it could be better, or this is horrible, la-di-da-di-da. And then continuously also that faith story of, you know, I know that God is in this with me or something. And I think a lot of people who journal do see that back in their journals. So it's almost like we are all a little bit of a psalm writer. And I don't know if you remember when Carla Grosch-Miller did come to meet with us on Zoom and made us all write our own lament. And to do that with the congregation, I did that with the congregation, is an extremely powerful exercise, actually, where people get that chance to pour out their whole heart and to then find a way of reorientation, especially when you tell them you don't need to read it out at the end. This is for you. And you take it away and nothing will happen with it but for you. Because I think then people are free to reorient in a way that nobody else needs to know necessarily, and are therefore more open in how they present themselves and their own heart to God. Sorry, I don't know really where this is going, but I think it's just sad that we don't preach more often from the Psalms. I don't either. And yet people find incredible richness, like we do, in the Psalms.
Well, absolutely, yeah. I mean, that's why there are separate books of Psalms published, isn't it?
Yeah.
People just carry them around with them and leaf through them, and it is part of some people's spirituality to read the Psalms regularly over and over again, isn't it? As a worship book, a worship resource. As I mentioned, much like hymn books used to be, I think, in people used to take their hymn books home with them, didn't they, and use them as a worship resource. Psalms should be that in people's lives, I think. I always admire people who can do the journaling thing. Maybe it's just me. I find it very difficult to write stuff without having an internal editor editing myself into what I should be writing. I must be writing something here about faith, and I just find it very difficult to write that. I can think it, but when it comes to writing it down, I tend to edit myself very heavily. So and also I'm lazy, so those two things don't combine well to make me into a journaler. But I think they're really. I think that's really fascinating insight that's what you find when you look back on that pattern of writing, and I know that in my head from how I feel each day, but because I haven't written it down, it's difficult to then trace the pattern. But it's fascinating to hear that pattern, matches or mirrors the psalmist. So yeah, that's really cool. So where were you going to go with these readings, Henriette?
Yeah, I was also going to Psalm 27. That's a little bit boring, but I have a special thing. Yeah, sorry, and I did not read the same commentary yet. Oh dear. I have a special thing with Psalm 27 because it was my first assessed service that I had to do in Westminster College, which is always, as we all know, so much fun to do. And
a blessing.
Actually, yeah, Neil was at that time the director of pastoral studies, and he was the one who would dish out the texts to you a week before. So, and we were all so naive. Well, some of us, me, were all so naive, thinking that over the years it would become better. But little did we know that actually we're doing an assessed service every Sunday. So, but so Psalm 27 is very special to me because I did preach on it, and I loved that psalm for many of the same reasons as Tim pointed out, and also for me it is almost like you already said, Phil, the antidote to last week's psalm, right? Last week it was, as long as I proclaim God's name over things, all will be well. But here it is, well, actually, no. I am in the middle of life, which is a little bit crap. And still, I do have that faith to fall back onto. And the bit that I love so much in this psalm is, for he will hide me in his shelter in the day of trouble. He will conceal me under the cover of his tent. He will set me high on a rock. And we always went camping when I was little, all throughout my life. So that whole idea of a tent is very very dear to me, and I can really imagine something with that. And the thing where it says, come, my heart says, seek his face, your face, Lord, do I seek. I think that is also such a beautiful passage, because for me, this psalm is about a time when there is real trouble going on, and when really no one else is there to help anymore. Then who are you going to look for? Who are we then seeking? And for people of faith, it will be God's face. And I remember using in that assist service an image of, or an example, an illustration of the son of another student. We had these, sometimes we also had fun at college.
Terrible.
And we had this evening full of games and fun. And there was this student, and he did a sketch together with his son. And where someone is sitting behind someone else, and you have the arms, and you do anyway. So this little boy, he was being fed bread by his dad in his mouth, but he could not eat it as quickly as his dad stuffed it in his mouth. And of course, the dad could not see him, and the little boy could not tell his dad, like, oh, I'm choking, but he was actually really choking. And we students were sort of like looking, oh, should we do something, but not doing anything. And suddenly, and I will never forget this image, suddenly this boy's eyes just found the face of his dad's friend. And he was just looking at him like, help me. And without any hesitation, this guy got up and just pulled him away from the whole scene, and started banging his back and stuff like that. And for me, it was such a fantastic illustration of, and that is what we do when we are in trouble. We kind of like go and seek God's face, and that is where we look, when we are totally in trouble. Or if we don't have faith, then we will look somewhere else, perhaps. And for me, that was all linked then to the Luke reading, where the Pharisees said to Jesus, get away from here, or Herod wants to kill you. So there were either Pharisees that were not against Jesus, which we know there were Pharisees that were not against Jesus. But there is also that idea of, how come that suddenly, just before his crucifixion, the Pharisees were saying, get away from here, Herod is trying to kill you. Jesus knows, or seems to know in this passage, that he is not going to get help from anywhere anymore. His way is set to Jerusalem. He knows that it's coming up, the event for which he was coming to the world. And the Pharisees are not going to help him. Herod is not going to rescue him. Actually, there is no one that is going to rescue him. And that psalm is very much connected for me to that passage. Like, Jesus then, the only one who he focuses on is God, and what God is going to do for him. So I was going to focus on that, and then link it to our own lives, because there will be a point in our lives that there is no one anymore who is going to help us. Not the doctors, not our family, not our friends. Who are we going to look for? Whose face are we going to focus on in that moment when there is nothing else anymore that can help us? The end.
It was a silence of wow, that's a really powerful preaching image. I hadn't really picked that out of the psalm, looking for the face. Once I got over the shock of the death trap, which is Westminster College training program.
Right, exactly.
But yeah, the power of that image, I think, I might even go with that, because that is really powerful image. So thank you for that. You've certainly left me with an image that I'm gonna, I think, reflect upon in this coming week. Your your tent imagery as well in Psalm 27 is also incredibly similar to the hen gathering her brood under her wings. That's like a tent, like a big feathery tent. The God who wants to gather us in around her skirts is a lovely image. And sometimes I think, these aren't like most obviously easy passages. Luke 13, there's a bit of a bitty passage. It's two bits stuck together, I think, isn't it? It is a lament, the second half of it. Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the city that kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to it, is a lament, most people seem to think. So it goes well with psalms of lament that you were talking about, and inviting congregations onto that journey of lament, or that practice of lament. There's all sorts of powerful things you can do, which we're allowed to do in Lent. We're allowed to do slightly less jolly stuff in Lent, aren't we? And it's a space for us to allow that to happen. So yeah, thank you for that. Neil, where were you going to go? Hopefully Philippians.
Funny you should say that. I think we've given the Old Testament passages a pretty good run. So yeah, let's dive into Philippians and Luke. I think the Philippians text. One of the things that I would reflect on with the Philippians text is there's something kind of at the heart of this about what is it that our lives are directed towards? What are our lives oriented towards? Are they oriented in the directions that God wants us to go, or are they oriented in the directions God doesn't want us to go? And I think we get a sense of Paul is saying there are things that can distort our lives and that can twist our lives away from what God wants, and there are other things that really give us life in all of its fullness. And here we are again, second Sunday of Lent, and one of the things that we do in Lent traditionally is it can be a time of lament and a time of confession, a time of recognizing that the reason we are headed towards Easter is that all is not well with the world, and God is coming amongst us to reconcile the world back to God's self and reconcile us to each other. And I think this little bit of Philippians takes us to the, very much into the heart of that. And I think one of the things that's interesting about it and that kind of made me pause was how Paul begins in what seems like tremendous arrogant, Paul's lovely arrogance of, well, look at me. If you want to know how to do this, then look at how I do this. And it's kind of, we hear from time to time in Paul's letters stuff that kind of switches us off to him, I suspect. And this may be one such moment. But one of the commentators that I was looking at made the point, actually, there is an incredibly evocative thing going on here. Here is a Christian saying to a church, being a Christian is not the simplest thing. It's hard and it's challenging. And actually, it's very easy not to be a Christian. So how do we know what it looks like to live a Christian life? Well, look at some of the people around you who are having a go. So that may not, so actually, rather than Paul saying, please put me on a pedestal because I am the perfect example of a Christian, it may be Paul saying, I'm not the perfect example of a Christian, but I'm having a go. I'm having a go. So look at me. And it just then begs interesting questions, I think, for us in our preaching in a congregation to say, well, what would it be for a congregation to look around itself and say, so who are the saints here? And, we can all, I think we will all have our canon of amazing people who have helped us in the faith. And they may be people we've never met because they died long before we were born, but we've read their stories or we've read their theology, you know, the Desmond Tutu figure or whatever. But what does it mean and that's great. And you know, that might be part of what's coming in this sermon. But what would it be to say, but actually, what does it mean to look around the people sitting in this building listening to this sermon? Ordinary people, yrC folk, or whatever we are. What does it mean to actually look at one another and say, you're helping me be a Christian? You know, you may not feel that you are, but actually you are. And equally, what does it mean for me to construe my life as being a walking, talking visual aid for other people about what it is to be a Christian? And I think that then connects, perhaps, I mean, I may be stretching this slightly, but I think it could connect with where Jesus is in Luke 13. That amazing sense of God wanting to gather everyone in, and the lament that Jesus gives over Jerusalem. You know, here I am, and I can't gather you in. You won't let me gather you in. I've come to try and show you what it looks like when we live this faith out, and it's hard because not everyone wants to say yes. And that's a very 21st century Western experience of Christianity. Not everyone wants to say yes. So what does it mean to faithfully keep on living out the life of faith? And then a final sort of set of thoughts, which is this gathering in. It is interesting that if you wanted to put the Luke 13 into the wider kind of gospel story, you know, Luke's is the gospel that begins with the shepherds being the ones who are brought to see the baby in Bethlehem. And what we know about shepherds at the time of Jesus is that shepherds were, if not outcasts, they were certainly living on the edge of society because they couldn't abide by a lot of the rules and regulations that meant that you were, you know, seen to be living a holy life. And I mean, you get in the Gospel of Luke, you get the prodigal son, you know, who seems to have thrown everything possible away and then is welcomed back by the father who is running to meet him, which is the last thing the father should be doing. And you get a good Samaritan, you know, and the whole point of telling stories about Samaritans is that they're meant to be the people that we don't like and the people who aren't so holy as we are. And so again and again, I think there might be a sermon here that is about what does holiness look and feel like, and where do we see it? And we're being prompted to see it in one another, which is both terrifying, because if we're honest, if I'm honest, there'd be an awful lot of my life that wouldn't bear close scrutiny as an illustration of how to live as a Christian. But nevertheless, there might be bits that do. And that might be quite a, you know, on this second Sunday of Lent, that might be quite something to help a congregation explore.
I think that's a fascinating question to ask, because you're dead right. It is at both at the same time inspiring and terrifying. But we generally like our inspiring people to have flaws, don't we? Because we perceive that. I sometimes think when you have those like big Christian rallies and they wheel somebody out to give their testimony. In the olden days, when I was young, they used to wheel out. It would always be somebody who'd committed 9 horrific axe murders and was in Pentonville, and then had a dramatic conversion to Christ after killing 4 prison guards and then escaping and meeting a vicar and then becoming a Christian. And then so his testimony is the one, and this shows the power of God. And I would kind of sit there and think, yeah, but I'm not an axe murderer. And so I've often said to people, the more ordinary you are, the more potential you have to be walking, talking, living, breathing demonstration of what the gospel means to
Absolutely.
ordinary people who live next door and down your street. Corrie ten Boom was great, but most people say, well, that's not my situation at all. My situation is I live in this village next door to Phil, which is terrible, obviously. But I think that's really powerful to encourage people to think like that. And you kind of think, well, yeah, okay, imitate me, but don't look too closely. I don't want to come under complete physical scrutiny, or do I? I mean, it's a good thing for us to be challenged and maybe imitated. Because then it makes us think about who we are and how we are, how we live. We often think about it with our children. I think for those who have children, do we when we spot our kids doing things that we do, you think, oh, when they start swearing age 3, then maybe you think, oh, but I love it when I find my kids and they are fabulous, acting with grown-up integrity and generosity, and I think, well, suddenly they're grown up and they're acting with great intelligence and integrity, and I think maybe we had something to do with that. And then I think, nah. I love to see it in my kids. It would be great to see it in our congregations, but also to see it in them. I think it's just a fascinating question to ask, Neil. Thank you for that. That's fabulous. And the gathering in thing, I was distracted by that. Sorry, there might be drilling sounds. We're having a new bathroom in. There's builders all over the house. That line at the end of Jesus' lament, how often have I desired to gather your children together as a hen gathers her brood under wings, but you would not. That is so real, isn't it? As you point out, it's our experience of the world. How often would we have gathered people in and brought people into Jesus' presence, or made an effort to introduce people to who God is, and they would not. You can feel Jesus' frustration here, brooding over a whole city, and I'm sure most ministers and churches have felt that. We may be imperfect, we may be not the best people to imitate, but you would not. And that's a lament, isn't it? That's a lament that the world appears not to want Jesus, as Jesus has been rejected right from the beginning. Appears not to want it. They simply would not. And I do keep chickens, and chickens do this. Chickens do gather chicks under their wings. You probably all know other birds do it as well. I think gooses do it as well. But chickens are famous for it. And if you look hard enough, you'll find on the internet stories about fires in barns and farmers going to survey the wreckage afterwards and finding a dead chicken and sort of kicking it to one side, and underneath a brood of 4 or 5 chicks, protected from the fire. It's a very obvious image of what Jesus is doing here. Is taking the force of the blow, if you like, sheltering the world under her wings. They do that, but there is also a sense in this, there's a slight tension in this, that chickens don't generally run about collecting chicks when danger threatens. If a cat comes into the garden, or a fox or something, if there's no cockerel around, the cockerel will go and attack the fox regardless, even if it's instant suicide. To protect the hens, the cockerel will go and attack the fox or the dog or whatever it is. And the hen will protect the chicks, will gather the chicks. They are both fiercely protective creatures, but the chicks have to come. Cats will pick off chicks. If there's 2 chicks who don't come, the cat will corner them off, and the mother can't do anything about that. The chickens have to come. But they have to come and gather. And the two that would not, they're going to get eaten by the cat. Because she can't get up and go and get them, because then there's like four more. So there's a tension in that I kind of got a bit distracted about this push and pull between God gathering us under his tent, like in Psalm 27, and bringing us all in, and us needing to be a part of that, to respond in some way, to actually move towards God for that to happen. But where the balance is in that is one of those eternal questions that Neil wants to answer during Lent. One of those big questions. How much is God saving us, and how much are we responsible for our, the process of our salvation? What steps do we have to take, and if so, what are they? And but this says, I would have done it, but you wouldn't. You wouldn't, which I think is a desperately sad lament that Jesus is offering here. So yeah, there's all sorts of stuff in there. I just love this, the idea of maybe twinning Luke and the Psalm. I know I challenged Neil to go and talk about Philippians, and you did a bold attempt there. I generally only pick two though, so I don't know how many readings congregations can actually physically grapple with in a service that only lasts 1 hour, and take seriously. So if I was going to pick two, I'd go with the Psalm and the Luke. I think that other choices are available. Other combinations of 4 readings are possible. So, but there's other stuff we can do, and you may have started some Lent stuff already in week 1 that you need to continue through week 2, unless it didn't work, in which case you'll quietly forget about it, not do it in week 2. Neil has a giant pile of rubble down the centre of the church still. What ideas have you come up with alongside these readings to try and bring some breadth and depth to the worship experience? Where are we going? Going with Tim.
Yeah. The hen gathering the chicks is always a strong image, and we used to have a chap in my congregation. He died beginning of last year. He was a poultry farmer all his life. His son now runs the business locally, and the story he always told me, and he was a man of great faith, and the story he told me was when he was trying to decide whether or not he should start this farm way back in the 1960s or whatever it was. He came downstairs one morning and he had one of those sort of calendars with a faith quote, an inspirational quote each day. He turned it over, and the day he had to make the decision, it was that quote about the hen gathering the chicks under. And he took that as a sign he was going to start his poultry farm, which he then went and did. And he was a man who lived, just as I say, in a way, it was very simple faith, but it was very profound and very deep. And he gathered all sorts of people to him. The farm would employ people out of prison. It would employ people who other people wouldn't touch. Him and his wife belonged to the scheme where foreign students who couldn't get home would come and stay on the farm during vacations and things. It was someone who was truly inspired by this sort of reading. So there's something I'd like to tell that story, because they're quite well known around here. And you can go to local butchers and ask by name for one of their particular chicks or ducks or whatever it is. And then that idea of that, we were talking about Jesus and people having to come, and thinking of rallying cries, and you could ask people what would make them come. What slogan, what rallying cry would draw people to something? So you could ask people to come up with rallying cries and slogans, and you get things like I am lion, hear me roar. It's kind of a roar. Let's go. Would people come to Jesus with the slogan I am hen, see me gather? It's very different, isn't it? It's that thing of yet again turning the world's values on its head, really. So asking, what is it that makes people, what words would make people attracted to that? Other thought was Aesop's fables. Loads of stories there about animals. The animals we should mention. We've got the fox and the hen, and Lion is mentioned quite a lot in scripture. There's a very short fable which goes, the first time the fox saw the lion, he nearly died with fright. The next time he gathered sufficient courage to have a good stare. The third time he went boldly up to the lion and commenced a familiar conversation with him. And there's lots of examples of stories there. You could ask people, you could use sort of Neil's lining paper and ask people to draw pictures of animals and talk about the favorite animals and the qualities. Why are they attracted to those animals? What's the qualities that are displayed within them? What qualities appeal to us in people? Again, what is it? You know, how do we respond to people? So yeah, that's kind of a few thoughts there.
Sounds like one of those dreaded interview questions when they say if you were an animal,
What
what would
animal?
you
Yes,
be?
I know.
Yeah, so yeah, there's plenty in that. I would almost certainly take one of my chickens with me. Because there you go. It's an open goal, isn't it? Really. Kids love. Well, no, kids don't love chickens. Kids are petrified of chickens. They say, "Oh, that's nice," and then you take a bit closer, and chickens they look evil. They do. They've got an evil stare because they look at you at the side of their face like this, and then they go, and then they sort of lean in, and the kids think they're going to lose an eye, which they possibly are. So, yeah, safety goggles and everything required. But yeah, I like those ideas. Where do we go next? Our screen has switched around, and I'm terribly confused now. Everybody's moved when I wasn't looking. Henriette, what have you come up with?
Not an awful lot. I do think that when we say seek his face, your face, Lord, do I seek, then there is always a danger in a church that there is a prescribed way of how we should seek and how the face should look. So connecting that to the dwelling of a tent, I thought let's just raise the question of how does that even look to you, a tent? What kind of image calls it up to you when you think of a tent? And so therefore, what kind of image calls it up to you when you talk about the face of God, when you're seeking God's face? So here we go.
Oh, what a tent.
So exactly. So are we thinking of a tent like they maybe have been in those days, or our summer tent, or maybe our glamping tent,
Whoa.
or perhaps our festival tent?
Oh.
Or are we thinking about a completely different tent? You know, the whole idea that tents can mean something different to different people. Maybe, or do we think that a tent is something like this? So I thought maybe that would be a helpful way of bringing a little bit of nuance into the whole thing, but that's really it. That's all I came up with.
I love those tent images. I think that opens up all sorts of things. It's amazing how showing some pictures can suddenly prompt questions in your head over a text that I hadn't even begun to think about, because I think a tent's a tent, but it's clearly not. A tent isn't just a tent, is it? So yeah, thanks for that. And there's the old chicken being a tent. They really are. You know, that like the second tent you showed, the family camping tent, that looked so forbidding, didn't it? With all the zips down and whereas the first tent with the sort of big open space that look, you know, politicians are fond about talking about, you know, having a big tent, aren't they? Or, you know, I'm going to run a big tent government where everybody is welcome, and it rapidly becomes that closed off, zipped up tent, which you're not welcome into. You can't go wandering into that one, can you? That's fabulous. Thank you. Neil, what have you got?
So 3 quickies, really. I mean, in the light of some of the things we've been reflecting on in terms of the Bible readings. One thing that I suspect is pretty alien to a lot of our congregations is the whole idea of testimony, of someone just sharing, where this week God showed up in my life. It's kind of, I'm thinking back to your example, Phil, of the big stadium evangelistic event and the multiple serial killer who was converted in his conversation with the vicar or whatever. And an answer, one of the things that perhaps we need to help people feel more confident in is just that actually God shows up in our lives. And it doesn't always, it often is only, we see it in hindsight. And I think there are some Christian traditions where the most normal thing in worship would be for everyone to come able to give their testimony. So how we did it, creating that space, I think would be quite a challenge. And I don't think you can't just stand up on the second Sunday of Advent out of the blue and say, right, I now want you all to give your testimony. But maybe what you could do is use Lent as a time to just start to open up, where is God showing up in our lives? And there would be different ways of doing that in terms of inviting people to send in photographs or to write one-liners or words or to put pins on a map or whatever, but just some way to kind of take that Pauline sense of, we're trying to live out this faith. We can help each other, not least because we can tell the stories to each other of our own struggles, but also of our blessings. I mean, I think, again, there's maybe a tendency to kind of, we'll home in on how difficult faith is. Well, maybe sometimes we just need someone to be able to say, actually, it's just been this beautiful thing. This week, it was beautiful being a Christian. I just had this lovely experience. So that's one thought. Another thought for maybe more kind of intergenerationally, thinking of that sense of Jesus, wanting to gather people in, but also that bigger sense of God, coming to gather us. Have a jigsaw, and it'll have to be a fairly simple. I think it's probably not a 1,000-piece jigsaw. It's maybe a slightly simpler jigsaw, and get people to make the jigsaw. And of course, the classic thing that you've done is that there is one piece missing, and so the jigsaw is incomplete, and that could lead into all sorts of conversations about, what does it mean to gather to find the missing piece. And then the final thing, if I can just share, is that quite a few people in different styles and ways have gone to the Psalms and put Psalms to music. So this is just one example of many. If you just type into YouTube Psalm 27.
Hear me, O Lord, when I cry aloud. Be gracious and answer. You have said, seek my face, and my heart responds. Your face I will see. Your face I will see. Oh Lord, you are the one thing I desire, one thing that I long for, God, to be with you. And Lord, you.
Just one example. I mean, I must admit, I find it slightly odd that it suddenly seems like when we get to the God bit, we get cigarette smoke. But I think I would have to work my way through that. But they just are. I mean, particularly when it comes to the Psalms, I think because of what the Psalms are, but because of also that this is as it were, the hymn book of ancient Israel. it is often useful, I think, just, you know, with YouTube or whatever, just to type in a psalm and see how people have handled it across the ages musically. And there are some gems in there.
Yeah, I like that emphasis. I mean, Henriette brought it out earlier on about what it looks like to seek God's face or seek the face of a loved one. As you were playing that psalm, I was thinking of as the word "seek your face" came up on the screen. I was thinking, I think probably my most common seek your face moments are sort of when you're looking for someone at an airport or something, and the arrivals are coming in, and there's like a horde of people, and you're sort of scanning through unfamiliar faces, and suddenly you lock on to the face that you're looking for. And it's a kind of a special moment, isn't it, when you or maybe somebody's lost and you're scanning a crowd for a face, and when you lock on to that face that you're looking for, it's a moment, isn't it? Maybe the psalmist is trying to pick up on. I've just got a couple of things. One is just in response to what Neil just said. So I just went, if I looked a bit distracted, just because I was just typing into Google and listening to every word that Neil said whilst doing it. But you're talking about testimonies and how to do that. And it reminded me of something that I mean, it was kind of popular a few years ago. It seems to have gone a bit quiet now, but it's something called cardboard testimonies. You might have come across. It's kind of a simple way of introducing people to doing their testimonies, where you usually just give them you can go in a room and give them like cardboard squares. Usually it's just regular bits of old box, and give them a big marker pen. And the idea is that on one side of the box of a piece of cardboard, they write something that relates to how they felt or their condition before they had a strong faith. And then they turn the card over, which shows how they feel about that now with their faith. And so it's an easy way of offering just a tiny bit of testimony. It's not always a dramatic before and after. But anyway, I don't know what these examples are going to be, because this was the first one that came up on the search under cardboard testimonies. So I'll just play a couple just to give you the idea. Oh, don't know where that's coming from. Oh, yeah, here we go. They're not letting us see the actual things, are they? Yeah, well, you get the idea. It's just way too fast. So that's no good. So there's that. So they put something on the back and then something on the front, which is the transformation. You get the idea. And it's really powerful. I've done that with a couple of churches on away day things. And at the end, everybody's got one, and you have a kind of like a fashion parade of people come out one after the other, and they just hold one out and then turn it over, and the next one comes out and they hold it out and turn it over. And if you do that, and if you video it, then that can become almost like a church testimony. This is what is within our church. These stories of change and transformation are in the life of our church, and you can put that on your Facebook site as long as you've got the people's permission and all that kind of stuff. But it's telling our church story. This is who we are. We're people who are transformed. So that is one way of doing testimony that I think people find less threatening. The other thing, I kind of obviously had to have this in, which is a fabulous picture of a chicken sheltering her chicks in the rain. I mean, what's not to like about that? I mean, look at that. If you look up chicken sheltering chicks in rain, then you'll find that one. That goes around quite a bit. But it's a nice image of who God is in that psalm and in the Luke passage. It's also very nice to be able to put in female imagery for God and not get told off about it afterwards, isn't it? It's quite clearly a chicken. Cockerels don't do that. Chickens do that. So there you go. It's a nice opportunity to talk about God as she, without getting bricks thrown at you afterwards, after the service is finished. So that's kind of, I mean, obviously I'd take my chicken in and that would just steal the show and nobody would hear a word I said. But there you go. It's an obvious thing to do. I talked last week about setting up something where people took a thing home each week, to put on the points of a cross to follow Lent through, like the Advent candles. So obviously this week it would be a feather, or if you were Henriette, a tent peg. Think of something imaginative. A tent peg would be quite cool, wouldn't it? And they're not that expensive to buy a load of tent pegs, and you give everybody a tent peg. I'd obviously have to kill a chicken and pluck it, and then everybody could have a feather. And then put it on. I could use the one that I'd taken, couldn't I? I could just pluck them out and give them at the door.
It could be a congregational thing. You kill this chicken and pluck it collectively.
Yeah, maybe. Well, we don't have to kill it, really. We just pluck out the feathers. My chickens are battery hens. They're used to having no feathers. About the ones I've only just grown them back. So they're nice new feathers. So there we go. Yeah, no chickens were harmed in the preparation of this Talking Absolute Worship, and we don't suggest you harm any chickens either. There are places you can get feathers. A pillow, for instance. So yeah, have a go. Anything else before we wrap up this session? I think we've given people everything they need to prepare a service of worship for Lent 2. We've been talking absolute worship for about an hour. We've enjoyed discussing the passages together. I hope that maybe one thing has struck you. Maybe it struck you 20 minutes ago and you left then, in which case you're not listening to this bit. We're going to be preparing services for this coming Sunday, and you are too. And to help us in that task, Neil is going to pray with us.
Let's pray. Dear God, we thank you for your word with all of its complexities and all of its beauty. And we pray as we turn to it, as we help others turn to it, that through your Holy Spirit, we will find words to share about your word, and that your word will be a word of life for us all. In Christ's name. Amen.
Amen.
Amen.